Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Anyone remember what I told you from earlier, how terrible it would be to use ChatGPT for story generation? Can you please look at the light? I kind of wish the presentations were the other way around. They were not. Well, what is a story? What is a narrative? Some narratologists basically say a narrative consists of two parts. You have a story, which is what happens in the world, and then you have a discourse, which is how you tell this story. Like what kind of text or other output do you use to actually convey the information that goes on the story, the rendering of the story. Now, people have been doing a lot of research on this. To generate the story, the actions that happen in the story, using, are you pointing at something? Oh, okay. Using a narrative planner, and there is a narrative planner that you may or may not have heard of. Some of you are vaguely familiar with it, I think, called Clave, which basically takes care of this part of what can the characters do in the story, which actions are taken by his characters while satisfying some authorial goal. Right? There's an author that comes in and is like, at the end of the story, I want this to be true. Clave will take care of making the characters actually do things. So what do we want to do? We want to actually make text for a story that is generated by Clave. That's what this project was about, or is about. ChatGPT, we have also heard about before. And what ChatGPT does is it makes text. So now we have Clave that can make story, that can actually make characters do interesting things. And we have ChatGPT, which can make text for those things. So wouldn't it be great if we can just use ChatGPT to generate a discourse for a story that was generated by Clave? I'm going to open my slides here because I always have to turn around. Sorry. Okay, what could possibly go wrong? You already forgot what I told you earlier, so that's not even what I'm talking about this time. Maybe there are more things that can go wrong. So the process that we did is as straightforward as we could think of. We just take Clave, we make it generate a story, we take each of the steps that it outputs, we give that to ChatGPT and ask it make one chapter for each of the story steps. And we'll talk about why that's maybe not a great idea either, but that's like a first draft. Here's the first problem. What does Clave actually give us? It doesn't give us anything nice. It gives us some random nonsense, right? This is what it looks like. Hatch plan, Robbie, 6-shooter, brown horse, bank, mother load. What on earth? What are we supposed to do with this? Just ask ChatGPT. Like, this was undergraduate student research. It's like whenever they get stuck, it's like, just ask ChatGPT. No, I suggested, hey, we could just tell ChatGPT, like, turn this into something useful. And it did. So we said, like, here's, you gotta get a string of words, some random nonsense, turn this into something, something that is actually good, like text that represents what's going on there. And we gave it an example, right? We said, like, here's some random story plan that we found. Here's how we would translate this one story plan step. And now do this for all possible story plan steps that we might have. And it actually, that part actually works wonderfully. I have to say, I'm amazed. So we told it, like, for this weird nonsense that I showed you earlier, it said, like, Robbie hatched a plan to rob the bank with his trusty 6-shooter and brown horse to strike the mother load. Wonderful, lovely. So instead of giving ChatGPT directly what gave output, we first give it that to turn it into a description. Then we take that description and say, now turn this description of what's happening into a full chapter. And then we have a story, right? Yeah, we have a story, but if we do this, it kind of doesn't know what happens in each chapter, right, from the previous chapter. So it takes the step describes what should be happening, but it doesn't have any context. And it really likes doing things like to be continued, or it really likes doing things like making up new characters because it doesn't know what came before, or the story just goes in a very different direction. So the solution we came up with this is we actually take the previous story chapter and give it that as part of its prompt. And then say, like, now make the continuation of that story where you left off. There's a problem because you have limited context, so you cannot pass it the entire story. And even if you could, there are some models that have larger context windows, it dilutes what it pays attention to. So it actually is useful to give it less information. Tried a bunch of different things. We also made it summarize the previous chapter and just use the summary because that will make it focus on the important parts of the previous chapter. So now the next problem is it still likes doing things like to be continued because it doesn't know that the story will continue. So we actually do the story generation part first, and then we do a second pass where we can tell it this is the previous chapter, but also this is what the next chapter is going to be. So in the second pass, it takes the previous and the next chapter from the previous pass to regenerate the current story chapter. And now we get text. Here's some output. And it's long, right? I'm not going to read all of it, but from this story step that I showed you before, basically what it does, it starts the chapter, it continues and continues. It's like a few pages, like 2 pages or so. But it really makes up like in the dusty down of Redwood Creek, the sun beat down mercilessly on the wooden buildings, blah, 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 and so on. So the nice things it does, presumably, is it comes up with names for things, right? It actually names the town, it makes up new characters, it names the horse at some point. It does all kinds of really good story looking things. So yay, we're good, we're done, everything is great, right? Thank you for your attention. No. So it was ChatGPT 3.5. We also tried this with 4.0. And it also, like, again, this is the start of the story. It looks very story-ish. Would anyone like to read the book that was generated by ChatGPT? Because I have it here. Okay, so for the rest of the talk, I'm going to tell you why you don't want to read this book. Yeah, any problems? ChatGPT knows what makes a good story. That's actually really interesting. The problem is that's the only thing it knows, and that's what it keeps doing. Right? Once you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. It knows in stories there's conflict. It knows in stories there is mystery, danger, and so on. And it just keeps doing that over and over and over again. That's the only thing that ever happens in the story, with very few exceptions. And one is absolutely hilarious. That's going to come later. But most of the time, it just makes weird conflict things. So here's part of the table of contents from this book that I have here. And you can see it really likes making chapters called like A Risky Proposition or The Whispering Shadows or The Hidden Saloon, right? Everything is kind of dark and gritty and dangerous, and it makes sense. Like in the abstract, yes, that's what makes a good story. Huh? Which one?
Risky Proposition.
Yeah, there's like a lot of risky proposition. So the nice part is this is still following the plan from Clave. So if you actually look at this, it does make a coherent story that follows some sort of progression, but basically each chapter is just escalating and like bad things are happening. It doesn't read well. And then you have chapter 7, which is the Tomato Festival, which I will get to in a second, which is kind of the outlier here. Yeah, it really likes strangers. It really likes mysterious encounters. And one thing it does is, well, you need strangers, so it just introduces strangers. Like every chapter has a new character that shows up, does something very important, and then never shows up again. And we tried telling it, these are the characters that you have. Sometimes it listens to you for like the first half of the chapter, and then it's like, oh, screw it, I need some other person. I'm going to introduce Hank. Hank always shows up somehow. Sometimes you tell it these are the characters, and it changes the name of the character that you give it to Hank. So it's clear that it's the same person. But it's like, nope, this one is called Hank. I don't care what you think it should be called. So yeah, so that is not great. And then even very loose guidance can result in very specific outcomes. We tried to make it tell stories in, what was it, late 19th century. I was like, okay, that's very vague and open. It could be anywhere. It was in Victorian England, and the main character had, I forgot the name, but it was always the exact same name. It was like super specific. And it was not a name of in a story that exists. So it made up some name, but it always made up that same name. So yeah, it's a bit tricky. Then you have this setting called temperature. Oops. No, where are we? Here. you have this setting called temperature, which can control the creativity that it brings, right? If you set a higher temperature, the output should be more creative. If you set a lower temperature, it should be following the instructions more closely. The problem is we want it to follow the instructions because we have a story in mind. So if you set a high temperature, it will basically just ignore the plan that we gave it and make up its own specific story that it wants. If you set a low temperature, then the output becomes kind of repetitive, as I will show you, sometimes very repetitive. So the text looked nice, at least. Why is this not going? Is it good? Like what you read before on the slides, did this read like good text? Somewhat, right? Maybe. But how would you evaluate this? How would you actually take this entire book? Like, do a human subject study is one option, but I'm gonna tell you it's not a good book. So I'm not, and it's a long book. So I don't want 30 people having to read multiple terrible books for human subject study. For now, if I can just show like, oh, this is actually not great, that's good. And then maybe we can improve it. And at some point when it actually gets to the border where is it really still bad or not, then we can do the human subject study. But for now, it's like, how can we illustrate like how bad it is? One thing we looked into, is grammatical complexity of text. So there are actual measures. So we used like the Stanford NLP parser to parse the sentence structures. And then you can measure, there are two standard measures for this. One is the Ingres score and one is the Fraser score. Ingres score measures essentially the breadth of the parse tree, and the Fraser score is essentially the depth of the parse tree. It's not exactly that because it has some modifiers depending on what, if it's a noun, it's like plus 0.5 or something like that. But that's kind of the intuition behind them. Okay, so we can measure this, we can calculate this automatically, but what do these numbers mean, right? I can tell you, oh, Fraser score is 7. Okay, cool. I don't know what that means. Is that good? Is that bad? We can compare it with human authors. So this is what we did. We took some human written books, classics, or books that might be considered classics, computed the Fraser scores and the Ingres scores for the sentences in those human authored books, and then we compared that with the scores, with those same scores on the generated stories that were generated by ChatGPT. So that's the lovely graph I have here. We plotted the entire distribution of those scores, again, because it's not clear if lower is good or higher is good, right? Human authors, it turns out, use a bit of a distribution of some sentences are simpler, some are more complex. So here we have, in the first row, we have human authored stories. This is Frankenstein, Pride and Prejudice, Les Miserables, and Sherlock Holmes, the English translation of Les Mis. In the second row, we have 4 stories generated by ChatGPT 3.5. In the third row, we have 4 stories generated by ChatGPT 4.0. And in the last row, I was wondering what would happen if I told it to emulate the style of the authors of the first row. So I made it generate a novel in the style of Mary Shelley. So that's the first one, and then Austen and Hugo and Doyle. And as you can see, what happens is those are not simple books, right? Those are not generally considered like trivial literature. They are not the most complex books ever written either, but they're like decent books. The complexity of the sentences in those books is actually surprisingly low. I was surprised. I was like, they are not as complex as I would have thought. And the complexity, the grammatical complexity of the sentences generated by ChatGPT is generally much higher than those. And once you tell it to emulate the style of these authors, it just goes even more complex. And that's what makes that's one of the things that makes the text kind of hard to read, because every single sentence is kind of, tour de force. And it's just not fun to read them. That's just one aspect. I don't think if we just fix that, it will automatically be a good story, but that's something we noticed that just doesn't make it good. Okay, another thing, this is unfortunately a lot of text. I'll give you the highlights. We asked it to summarize one of the chapters in one of the stories. And it basically says, we found this artifact called it's too tiny, the Heart of the Ancients. And we're going to unlock its secrets, and then we're going to use it for the good of society and so on. It really likes happy endings. We tried making it write tragedies. And in the end of the tragedy, they always come together and everyone is happy and they're trying to fight for unity and a betterment of humanity and so on. So that happens. Also, this was the heist domain. So somehow, in this Western heist story, it started finding magical artifacts. Actually, before that, they went on a pirate ship. They went on a cruise to find this artifact, and it just completely left the story that we wanted to tell behind and told its own story. So that's what I mean. If you set the temperature even a bit higher, it does weird things. Then we have the Tomato Festival. This is also from the heist domain. At some point, between all of these mysterious encounters and strangers and whatnot, it decided the main characters needed more money. And to get more money, they do what these Western gangsters do. They threw a tomato festival. They collaborated with local farmers to sell produce. It is bizarre. It's actually in this one book that I brought because it's absolutely funny. Then I have really, like, most of this talk is just like things that went wrong. That's why I wasn't accepted at the main conference, because this is basically negative results. I like this one. Robbie led Barry to a table in the corner, and he was too drunk. He needed to sober up, so he gave him some whiskey, which is generally how that works. Yeah. And then finally, I mean, it can generate text. The text is not great. It's sometimes wrong. It's sometimes completely, something that has nothing to do with the story that we want to tell. But part of that is also our mapping is not great, right? I tell it to tell a story about each plan step, a chapter for each plan step. And sometimes the step is just go from A to B. And then it has to write 2 pages on how this person goes from A to B. It kind of has to make up things for that. So I can't blame it for that part, I guess. But then 3 times in our entire experiment, so we generated hundreds of stories, it happened that the entire chapter text that it generated was this. The genre is action, adventure, and mystery. The end. That's the entire chapter. Most of the time, when you tell it, make a chapter, it actually makes a chapter, just sometimes it does not. Okay, I have some additions that are not in the paper that we have been doing lately. I had a student actually plot the Ingwer and Fraser score for each sentence in the story. And you can see this weird pattern in the middle here. What happened there? It just outputs the same sentences over and over and over again. And that's actually really nice. So we're developing this framework, these tools for more automated evaluation, because that's one of the ways we can actually detect these things. Most of the times it does well. Sometimes it just keeps looping somehow. And by having these tools available, we can hopefully evaluate that better. And then another thing that happened, if you set the temperature too high, it makes text, which technically this is text. Practically speaking, it is not the text that we want. So it literally sometimes just gives up and produces random, I don't know what's going on. I really don't know where all of this is coming from. Okay, so this is my talk. Use ChatGPT for story generation. It's awesome. If you want to read the book, let me know. I do want the human subject study, but it's a terrible book. That's how I'm selling my book here. Anyway, thank you so much for your attention.